Focus on Abilities was brought to you by Tier Memorial Hermann, redefining rehabilitation, removing barriers, re-enabling independence. And the ILRU Southwest ADA Center, promoting compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Welcome to Focus on Abilities, a program about issues affecting the lives of people with disabilities. I'm Lex Frieden. I'll be your host for today's program. We have a special guest, and we're taping on scene at Tier Memorial Hermann in the Research Center. So please stay tuned. We'll be right back and watch Focus on Abilities today. This is Focus on Abilities on HTV. I'm Lex Frieden, and our guest today is Maria Town. Maria's from the White House. She's the disability liaison there, and we want to talk to Maria about some of her experience working in the highest office in the land, I guess you could say. Maria, welcome to Focus on Abilities.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Maria, you, in your role as the disability liaison to the president, you see a lot of what goes on behind the scenes. It must be a lot of effort to keep the president briefed, to make sure that all the wheels are turning. How many people approximately work in the White House, do you know?
I think it's about 2,000. I could be off on that number. But for a federal agency, that's actually quite small. The White House does not have regional offices like a lot of federal agencies do.
Right. Mm-hmm. But all those 2,000 people essentially are there to ensure that the White House business works. And that includes the policies that the White House is involved in, all of the liaison work, the representation from different groups. I guess the White House is responsible for answering any questions that citizens may have.
Yes.
Do you, in your capacity, do you write replies to letters that come from ordinary citizens?
Yes, all the time. In a number of different ways. So there's the White House switchboard. Anybody can call the White House at any time. And sometimes people will just say, I need to ask a question about disability, and the switchboard will route them to me. And it could be a very individual matter. And that's technically not my job, but I still have to figure out how to respond to it. And then many people write the president every single day. And he reads 10 letters every night. And so I'm on a listserv that shows folks which letters the president is going to read. And often I'll make sure to identify the ones having to do with disability so that if the president chooses to respond, I can be informed in that response.
Now, wait a minute here. I'm very curious about this.
Yep.
People write a letter to the president, and somebody on the staff determines which ones the president reads?
So I'm actually not sure about the process that happens to determine which 10 he gets a night. But if you think the president gets tons of letters every day,
hundreds, yeah,
right? You know, he and Santa Claus probably get the same amount of mail, and he can't read all of them all the time, right? So our White House correspondence team is wonderful, and they'll pull 10. Usually the letters relate to big themes that the White House is working on. So gun violence, substance abuse, criminal justice reform, education access, social justice in general. So we'll get letters. I got a letter from, I read through a letter from a mother whose daughter has an intellectual disability who talked about the process that they went through so her daughter could cast a vote. And talking about how excited her daughter was to cast a vote for the first time and how important she thought it was. And the president will read that letter, but I can also read that letter and write a note to the mother and the daughter myself, which is important for me to do.
And I think this is important too. People probably don't know this, but I'm familiar with the Bush Library in College Station, Texas. It's part of the National Archives. It's the presidential library, and President Obama will have one.
Yes.
In Chicago,
I think.
So all of those letters, any letter that somebody writes to the president,
Yep.
is archived.
Yes.
It's available. Somebody in the future In the 25th anniversary, we went into President Bush's archives and we found letters that people with disabilities wrote to him before he signed the ADA, talking about how important it was. And some of those letters actually are on the website of the Presidential Museum.
One of the things that my office likes to do is bring who we call letter writers into the White House for events. I think one of the more successful events that we've done is a round table with, we called them ACA letter writers, so people that had written to the president about the Affordable Care Act. And they met with him, I believe, in the Roosevelt Room and talked with him about things that they were excited about with the Affordable Care Act and things that they were worried about. And so whenever I look for people to include in events, I often work with the Office of Correspondence to say, do we have any letter writers who've written about disability and employment or disability and education?
Maria, if somebody wants to visit the White House, a lot of people, have never been to the White House and may not think they can. They used to do tours. Is that still available?
Yes. We do lots and lots of tours. So there are a couple of different ways to schedule a tour. One way is to contact your Congress folks, your senators or representatives, and ask for a tour. Another way would be to contact somebody like me and arrange for a tour.
So these are public tours that are done at certain times during the day and during the week.
Yes.
And it's only the public places in the White House that people tour, right?
So we have East Wing tours and we have West Wing tours, and they work a little bit differently. The East Wing is the residential part of the White House. That is the part where the first family lives, and they live primarily on the second floor. So when you go on an East Wing tour, you're seeing what in my head is the basement and the first floor, the blue room, the red room, and the green room, along with the state dining room, etc. And that is a self-guided experience.
Wow.
For West Wing tours, the West Wing is the working part of the White House. That is where the president has his offices, the vice president, senior advisor Valerie Jarrett, etc. So those only occur very late at night after most people have left. So sometimes I might be giving a West Wing tour that starts at 9 p.m. And take people around the West Wing where they can get a view at the Oval Office and the Roosevelt Room, and then go into the press briefing room.
And many people don't realize, but next to the White House, on the White House campus, is a big building called the Old Executive Office Building.
No, it's
been changed now, right?
Yeah, it's now the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, and that's where my office is.
And that building houses probably the bulk of those 2,000 or so people that work at the White House.
It does. The West Wing is fairly small. The West Wing was the brainchild of Teddy Roosevelt because he wanted to basically be able to live and work in the same place, and at the time he only had access to private offices in the East Wing, which could not accommodate his staff. So the only folks who really work in the West Wing are really senior people and their assistants. The vast majority of other White House staff, as you've mentioned, work in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, formerly the Old Executive Office Building.
There are many amenities for people who work there. It's not easy to go in and out of these places because of the security.
Yeah.
I've been there, and the security line clearance took 30 minutes. Do you have to go through that each day?
There are staff entrances that we don't have to deal with the long lines, but every time I enter and exit the building, I have to swipe a badge, I have to put all of my stuff on a X-ray belt, and I have to walk through a metal detector. I can't access my computer if I don't have my badge in. Wow. And there are a lot of restraints with our tech security. So for example, I can't use Facebook at work, I can't go onto my personal email at work. If you sent me a Google Docs document, I couldn't open it at work. And this is something that I've had to train advocates. So if you send me a statement that you put out on your Facebook post, I need you to copy and paste it into an email because I can't read it.
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of things have changed. I mean, that security probably years ago, maybe when was the first time you ever visited the White House?
So I didn't visit the White House until maybe 2010 or 2011. The first time I ever visited was for an event in the East Wing celebrating Women's Equality Day.
Did you expect at that time, or did you, in your mind, a lot of young people get the idea, someday I'd like to work here. That'd be cool. Did that ever occur?
No.
To you? When did you decide I want to work for the president?
So I mentioned that the position that I'm in had been what's called a detail before, which means that people came and went every 6 months. And in DC, as my predecessor's detail was coming to an end, it was kind of a thing, oh, who's going to get it next? Who's going to get it next? And I remember thinking in my head, I would be really good at that job, and I would really like to serve the president, but I didn't think it was my time. I'm still a relatively young and new leader in the disability community, and I think a lot of people assume that to work at the White House, you need to be really well established. And when I got the phone call saying that they wanted to consider me, I really couldn't believe it, and I was so honored just to be asked to interview.
I want to hear more about that process, but first we're going to take a break. You're watching Focus on Abilities. I'm here today with Maria Town from the White House. This is Lex Frieden. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Lex Frieden. You're watching Focus on Abilities. Our guest today is Maria Town. Maria, we're talking about getting a job working for the president. You must have been thrilled.
I was.
When you get the phone call. And did that mean you had the job, or did that just mean you had an interview?
That just meant I had, I needed to update my resume as quickly as possible and send it over to my point of contact so that they could decide whether or not they wanted to interview me.
And then they called and you scheduled an interview. How many people were there to interview you?
So I had 2 rounds of interviews. My first interview was just one-on-one with a deputy director of the Office of Public Engagement. And then she made the determination whether or not to move me forward for a second interview. And ultimately they decided to move forward with a second interview, and this one was in person. My first one was over the phone. And phone interviews are always a little bit tricky for me because you can't see how the other person is reacting. But the in-person interview was also more intimidating than usual because I went to the West Wing. I waited in the West Wing lobby, which is just kind of anxiety producing.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could be sitting there with the ambassador of the United Nations or any other thing.
Exactly, exactly. And you never know as people are running through the lobby, where they're going and what they're going to do. And so ultimately, I go to the West Wing and I interviewed with the same deputy director I had a phone call with and the director of the Office of Public Engagement, Paulette Aniskoff. And it went really quickly. They knew exactly what they wanted to ask and what they were looking for. And what they didn't tell me at the time was that they were, in addition to looking for a disability community liaison, they were also looking for someone to manage all of OPE's, the Office of Public Engagement's, agency portfolio. And because I came with a background working as a career employee at a federal agency, already doing a lot of interagency work, it made me really well positioned to manage both of those portfolios.
So the Office of Public Engagement agency portfolio means that you're also responsible for ensuring all the federal agencies have access to the White House? Exactly.
And that all the federal agencies know what priorities the White House is pushing out when, so that, for example, on Small Business Saturday, and the White House is doing a lot of work to lift up how we have accelerated small business growth in the United States. Tom Perez can be out shopping at a small business, and we can coordinate on that
Tom Perez is
the Secretary of Labor, I'm sorry. And so can Secretary Jewell. They can all be coordinated on their approach to Small Business Saturday.
And that's your job?
That's one of my jobs.
And Maria, sounds to me like really a full-time job.
It's more than full-time.
How many staff do you have?
It's myself and an intern.
It's just amazing. Do you ever sleep?
Yes.
That's
I don't do
incredible
much
too.
else.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But you're very efficient. I mean, you use a lot of media yourself, social media. You're always communicating with the community via Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and what else?
Email is big. I have a disability community stakeholder list that has thousands of people on it. I'm sure they're sick of getting emails from me because I send out stuff whenever we're announcing something new.
How many cell phones do you carry with you?
2.
2, okay, fine. And when you went to work for the White House, I suppose they had to do a background check did they ask where all you'd traveled and how many people you'd met when you traveled and
Sure.
all of those kinds of things?
And they do background clearances for a lot of federal employees. So I'd already had one going into the Department of Labor where I worked prior to the White House. And but yes, to work for the White House, you do have to fill out a lengthy form noting every place you've ever lived and listing a number of people who can speak to your character. And having been on the receiving end of a background check question, so you know, of friends who've applied for federal jobs, I know that I need to let everyone know that I've listed them as a reference and provide them with certain details.
The other thing is when somebody does apply for a federal job, they need to be ready for that.
Well, I was a resident advisor in college, and so a number of my residents, when they applied for federal jobs, listed me as a reference, but didn't tell me. And so I would have the FBI show up in my office to ask me questions, having no idea why. And it was always just like, why are you here? Oh, okay. Sure, I can answer questions about them. And, you know, they ask questions like, has this person left the country in the past 5 years? And there's just some things, right, that even your great friends may not know.
They wanted to know who I met with when I went to Japan 10 years earlier. And I'm telling you, my memory's pretty good. But to say everybody that I met with 10 years earlier, that's pretty rough.
Yep.
So my advice to those who are watching, who want to work for the White House and be in a secure position someday, is if you go traveling, make a note and put it in a notebook about all the people you've met and all the things you bought while you were there and all the things you talked about. Because someday somebody's going to ask you those questions.
Yep.
Maria, you've counseled a lot of young people on how to get employed by the federal government and so on. Are there any kind of basic suggestions you would give people who might be watching this show?
Sure. So one key note is that a federal resume does not look like a standard one-page resume. And I think this is really important for young people coming out of high school or coming out of college who've been taught the one-page resume rule. For a federal resume, it's more like a CV, right? So it's a list of everything that you have done in your life that may be relevant to the position. And I was really grateful to have people at the Department of Labor who walked me through this when I was applying for that job. Because if they hadn't coached me on how to create a federal resume, my resume wouldn't have made it past the initial screen for USA jobs.
That probably happens to a lot of people.
It
If
does.
somebody needs help about that, can they Google up help on how to create a federal resume?
Sure. The Office of Personnel Management has a number of tools that help coach people on creating a federal resume. And USA Jobs, too, has a kind of federal resume generator that you can type in information and it creates it for you. The thing that I will strongly recommend is really think about all of the things you've done, particularly for young people with disabilities. Volunteering is important and can help you get a job. So if you are applying for a job at, I don't know, let's say the Environmental Protection Agency, and you've spent time in Houston doing environmental cleanup projects, that should be on your resume as a volunteer experience.
Okay. And if you were in the Girl Scouts or the Boy Scouts or the Big Brothers and Big Sisters, anything like that?
Yep. As long as it relates to the position you're applying for.
Maria, the other thing people should know is that federal jobs exist not only in Washington, D.C., but in almost every community in the United States.
That's absolutely true. And there are some great maps that kind of showcase which federal industries are most prevalent in which areas. Two more things that I want to make sure I mention is that in addition to the federal workforce being really large and expansive, there's also the federal contracting workforce, which is huge. And the Obama administration made some changes to Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act that require federal contractors to hire more people with disabilities. And so folks with disabilities who are looking for jobs should be thinking about federal contractors in their areas who now have a really big incentive to hire them.
Well, incentive, there's a requirement.
Exactly.
And it's another one of those accountability
Right.
issues. Before, they were encouraged to hire people with disabilities. Now, when their contracts are reviewed, they actually check to see
Right.
how many people with disabilities they have employed.
Right. The other thing that young people especially should know about is something called the Schedule A hiring authority. And when you hear about the federal hiring process, I think the thing that comes to mind is red tape. People with disabilities can utilize an exempted hiring authority, which drastically cuts down on that red tape. And what you'll need in order to take advantage of that is something called a Schedule A letter. And there's a kind of form letter on the OPM website that you can use to build your own Schedule A letter and apply for federal jobs.
Now, for a while, Schedule A was used, I think, more than it might be now. Is there still agency heads who will go to the Schedule A to expedite the process?
Absolutely.
So what people need to understand is that the Schedule A helps an employer, in this case a supervisor or an agency head in the federal government, to get somebody in that position working more quickly than if
Right.
they go through an extended hiring process.
Exactly.
So a person who's eligible for Schedule A, and there may be many reasons why,
Right.
and you might want to mention some of those, but a Schedule A person cuts through a lot of that process and goes to the front of the line in some regards.
Bingo.
What kinds of disabilities qualify as Schedule A?
A large number of disabilities qualify as Schedule A eligible. The technical language is significantly disabled, but the interpretation of that language is quite broad. So it's everything from a mental health condition to a learning disability to something like cerebral palsy or blindness.
Now, there's a companion provision for veterans, correct?
Yes. You also get Schedule A eligibility if you have been a part of the Peace Corps or a part of the AmeriCorps Vista program for a limited amount of time.
Okay. So, Maria, given your experience working with the Department of Labor, working in the White House, would you encourage people to consider a federal career?
Yes. Yes.
What are the biggest advantages?
One is giving back. If you are motivated by social good and motivated to make change, the federal government is a great place for you. I think, too, is diversity. There are so many different kinds of people and different kind of jobs within the federal government that you could pursue just about anything. Are you interested in architecture? Great, go work for the Department of Transportation or the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Interested in science? Check out NASA, right? Interested in disability rights? Go look at the Administration on Community Living. There's so many opportunities and so many different kinds of people pursuing them. And the last reason is they're just good jobs, good hours, good benefits, and they can create a lot of opportunity for particularly young people with disabilities.
Well, you're speaking in generalities now, because
Yeah.
when you said good jobs, good hours, Maria, your hours aren't short. I know that. So.
Mine are not, but White House jobs are different than most federal jobs,
Right.
right?
Different in many, many ways.
Yes.
Maria, it's been great having you as a guest here today. I want to wrap the program up now, but we'll come back in just a second for some closing comments.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of you for watching Focus on Abilities. We'll be right back for some closing comments with Maria Town. You've been watching Focus on Abilities on HTV, the Houston's channel for information about what's going on. And I'm Lex Frieden. I'm glad to be your host today, and we've had a wonderful guest, Maria Town. Maria is the disability liaison for the White House. She works there with the president, and she has made a tremendous contribution to the lives of people with disabilities around the United States. In her role as a disability liaison, she's been able to help produce policies that were recommended by the White House, some of them that were endorsed by the White House, made by other agencies and other federal government wings, and she's been able to bring people with disabilities into the White House more than perhaps any other person in this role before her. Part of that's been due to her youthful knowledge of telecommunications, social media, and I think we will all learn more about how social media can bring us together in the future. But it's through leadership like Maria's that we will learn how to do that and how to work better with our elected leaders. Maria, it's been a real pleasure having you here today on Focus on Abilities. And I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you flew here last night late from Indianapolis, and you have to fly back late to Washington, D.C. Probably don't get in till midnight and have to be. What time do you go to work in the mornings?
I try to get there between 8:30 and 9, and I stay at least till 8:30 or 9 at night.
And all that time you have to go to meetings throughout D.C. and sometimes in and out of meetings out of town on the same day. Remarkable schedule, and we really do appreciate the efforts you've made on our behalf.
Thank you.
Maria, if we ask you what the one most significant, the most exciting, the most amazing, stupendous thing that ever happened to you while you were working in the White House, what would you say?
That's really hard. So one of the things that I had no idea would happen is something called a departure photo. And the president takes pictures with staff and their families as they leave the White House. And obviously I'm there at the very end of the administration, so we're all leaving and we've all started to take our departure photos. My family is very diverse. I have 2 younger brothers. All 3 of us have disabilities. My parents have been divorced for a really long time, and I have a sister-in-law and a nephew who is 2 months old now, who is multiracial. And when I told my family that this was going to happen and that they needed to get ready to come to D.C., they were all willing to do it. And that's a big deal because my whole family had never visited me in D.C. or in my previous place of residence, Atlanta. And the president welcomed them all in to the Oval Office with open arms.
Wow.
You know, my one primary thought was, don't fall. I have very bad balance. And he told me, he goes, thank you for your work. You're doing a great job. And I was so nervous. I just go, you are too. But he did this for each staff member.
Wow.
And one of the things that the White House has done is try to make sure that the White House staff reflect the diversity of America. And families just inherently are so diverse. They come in so many different shapes and sizes. And the president welcomed every single staff with their family with complete open arms. And that just means so much to me.
Well, Maria, thanks so much for sharing that with us. And thanks again for being our guest here today.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank all of you for watching Focus on Abilities on HTV. Thanks to our great crew who've been working on the program here today remote at Tier Memorial Hermann. And please join us next time for more Focus on Abilities. I'm Lex Frieden. Have a great day.
Focus on Abilities was brought to you by Tier Memorial Hermann, redefining rehabilitation, removing barriers, re-enabling independence, and the ILRU Southwest ADA Center, promoting compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act.